Welcome to our deep dive into Jessica Jones, a show that kind of proved superheroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes the toughest battles are fought within. We've got some fascinating articles about the show's impact, how it changed the whole superhero game, and even some viewership data to dig into.
Yeah, you know what really struck me was that Jessica Jones, it didn't just exist in this like dark, gritty bubble. It's set firmly in the MCU with all the references to the wider world, but it's still carved out its own space, exploring the psychological side of superpowers in a way we really hadn't seen before.
Yeah, it's like they took this established universe and said, okay, but what about the trauma? What about recovery, the messy relationships? And they weren't afraid to get dark with it. I mean, Kilgrave alone, that guy's enough to give you nightmares.
Oh, totally. Kilgrave is like a masterclass in villainous manipulation. He doesn't just control people, he warps their whole reality. The way the show uses his powers to explore the nuances of consent. Especially with Jessica, it's something you rarely see addressed so directly in any superhero story, really.
It's not just physical, but it's that mental and emotional control
Right.
that really gets under your skin.
Yeah.
And you see that lingering impact on Jessica even after,
Yeah.
That she's free from Kilgrave.
Exactly. It's not just about escaping the villain. The show really delves into those long-term effects of trauma. Jessica's PTSD, her struggles with trust, her self-destructive behaviors. It's all tied back to that experience with Kilgrave.
And it's interesting how they use Kristen Ritter's performance to convey that. There are these moments where she just shuts down emotionally, almost like a reflex. It's subtle, but it really gets to you.
It does. What's fascinating, too, is that the show doesn't present Jessica as this perfect victim. She's flawed, she's angry, she makes mistakes, and that's what makes her so relatable. You see her grappling with the aftermath of trauma, not just as a superhero, but as a human being.
Right. And she's not alone in that struggle either. Her relationship with Trish, especially in the later seasons, really digs into the complexities of female friendship. They're not just there to support each other blindly. They challenge each other. They call each other out.
Yeah.
And sometimes they even hurt each other.
Yeah. It's a far cry from that stereotypical best friends forever trope you see so often in media. Their dynamic feels real, messy, and full of conflict. And what's remarkable is that despite all the betrayals and disagreements, their bond kind of endures. It speaks to the depth and the resilience of those female friendships.
I'm curious about the decision to have an all-female directing team for season 2. Was that purely symbolic, or did it actually impact the way the story was told?
From what I've read, it was a deliberate choice by the showrunner, Melissa Rosenberg, to bring a different perspective behind the camera. And Marvel actually supported her vision, which is pretty impressive for the time.
Yeah, for sure. It makes you wonder how that impacted the portrayal of Jessica's trauma in her relationships. Did it bring a level of sensitivity or insight that wouldn't have been there otherwise?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it ties into a larger conversation about how representation behind the scenes can really influence the stories we see on screen.
It's not just about telling different stories. It's about who gets to tell them. And Jessica Jones definitely made a statement in that regard.
Absolutely. And that willingness to push boundaries, to challenge the conventions of the superhero genre, that's something that really sets Jessica Jones apart. We've been talking about Jessica's trauma, but the show doesn't shy away from depicting other character struggles as well. Trish, for instance. She goes through her own arc of addiction and self-destruction.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Her desire for power. Yeah. To be a hero like Jessica, it kind of consumes her. Like she's mirroring Jessica's self-destructive tendencies, but in a different way.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how the show parallels their journeys. They're both grappling with their own demons, their own versions of power and control, but they approach those struggles in vastly different ways, which ultimately puts a strain on their friendship.
And that tension between them, it's not just a side plot, it becomes central to the story. Especially in season 3, you see how their choices, their individual traumas, end up impacting each other in really devastating ways.
They're dynamic. It's a fascinating example of how the show subverts typical female friendships in media. There's this underlying sense of competition, of jealousy even, that adds a layer of complexity you don't often see.
Right. But it's not all doom and gloom, though. Despite the darkness, the show manages to find moments of humor, especially through Jessica's dry wit and sarcastic commentary.
Oh, for sure. It's that balance of humor and darkness that makes the show so compelling. It doesn't sugarcoat the tough stuff. But it also recognizes that even in the midst of trauma and recovery, there's still room for laughter and levity.
One thing I've always been curious about is the show's visual style. It has this distinct noir aesthetic, with the dark lighting, the shadows, the gritty urban setting. Did they make any specific choices with cinematography or color palettes to enhance that atmosphere?
Absolutely. The use of low-key lighting, for example, it creates a sense of mystery and suspense. You're often left in the dark, just like Jessica, trying to piece together the clues and unravel the truth.
And those tight close-ups on Jessica's face, especially when she's struggling with a flashback or a panic attack, they really draw you into her emotional state. It's like you're experiencing the trauma right along with her.
The show also uses color in really interesting ways. You'll notice a lot of deep blues and purples, which are often associated with isolation, melancholy, and inner turmoil. They really set the mood and reinforce Jessica's state of mind.
I'm thinking about that episode where Jessica confronts the family Kilgrave forced to move into her childhood home. It's such a turning point for her, where she starts to reclaim her past and confront her demons. The way they use lighting and shadows in that episode, it's almost suffocating. You can feel the weight of Kilgrave's presence, even though he's not physically there.
That episode is a great example of how the show blends its visual style with its thematic content. It's not just about creating a cool aesthetic, it's about using those visuals to enhance the emotional impact of the story.
Okay, so we've talked about the dark side of the show, the trauma, the complex relationships, the visual style. But Jessica Jones also had a significant impact on the superhero genre as a whole. It's like it opened up a whole new realm of possibilities, showing that you could tell these gritty, character-driven stories within the comic book universe.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting. Jessica Jones arrived at a time when superhero stories were starting to evolve. Beyond that traditional good versus evil narrative, audiences were ready for something more complex, something that reflected the realities of trauma, recovery, and social justice. And Jessica Jones delivered on all those fronts.
It's like it gave permission for other superhero shows and movies to explore those darker themes, to dive deeper into the psychological complexities of their characters. It wasn't just about saving the world anymore. It was about understanding the human cost of heroism.
And that shift in perspective, that willingness to embrace vulnerability and imperfection, it resonated with audiences. People were drawn to Jessica's flaws, her struggles, her relentless pursuit of justice, even when it meant putting herself in danger.
I think it also challenged the way we view female characters in superhero stories. Jessica was a far cry from the damsel in distress or the love interest. She was a woman in control of her own narrative, even when that control was challenged by trauma and manipulation.
Her strength wasn't just about physical power. It was about her resilience, her determination, her refusal to be defined by her past. And that resonated with viewers, especially women, who saw in Jessica a reflection of their own experiences, their own struggles, their own triumphs.
It's like she became a symbol of female empowerment, not because she was perfect, but because she was flawed, vulnerable, and yet still capable of kicking ass.
Exactly. And that representation, that visibility, it had a ripple effect throughout the entertainment industry. We started seeing more female-led superhero stories, more complex female characters who defied the traditional tropes.
And that influence, that legacy, it's still felt today. Jessica Jones paved the way for a new generation of superhero stories, stories that embrace complexity, nuance, and the power of human resilience. We've talked about how Jessica Jones broke the mold for superhero stories, but what about its impact on the real world? Did viewers connect with it? Did it spark any conversations?
Well, Netflix keeps their viewership numbers pretty close to the vest. But from what we can gather, Jessica Jones resonated with a huge audience, especially in that coveted 1849 demographic. Seems people were hungry for a superhero show that felt more grounded, more relatable, even if it delved into some dark territory.
Makes sense. We're drawn to characters who feel real, who have flaws and vulnerabilities. It's like we can see ourselves in them, even if they have superpowers and are battling villains with mind control.
Exactly. And I think the timing of Jessica Jones played a role in its cultural impact, too. It premiered right when conversations about sexual assault and trauma were starting to gain momentum in the public sphere.
So it wasn't just entertainment. It was tapping into a real cultural shift, giving voice to these experiences that were often silenced.
Precisely. The show's unflinching portrayal of trauma, abuse, and recovery really resonated with viewers, particularly women, who saw their own stories reflected in Jessica's journey.
And that's powerful. To see yourself represented in a genre that's traditionally been dominated by male characters and perspectives. It's like Jessica Jones gave permission for other stories to be told, for other voices to be heard.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about representation, it was about changing the conversation. Jessica Jones showed that superhero stories could tackle difficult issues with nuance and sensitivity without sacrificing entertainment value.
It's like it proved that you could have depth and complexity in a genre that's often associated with spectacle and escapism.
And that had a ripple effect. We saw other superhero shows and movies starting to explore darker themes, to delve into the psychological effects of trauma and violence. Jessica Jones helped pave the way for a more mature and introspective approach to superhero storytelling.
And not just in the superhero genre, right? I feel like its influence can be seen in other types of shows as well. The flawed anti-hero, the complex female characters, the willingness to tackle tough social issues. These are all elements that have become more prevalent in television as a whole.
You're absolutely right. Jessica Jones was part of a larger cultural shift, a movement towards stories that were more grounded, more character-driven, and more reflective of the complexities of the human experience.
So to bring it back to our listener, why does all of this matter? What can we take away from the legacy of Jessica Jones?
I think it shows us the power of stories, to change perceptions, to spark conversations, to make us think differently about the world around us. Jessica Jones proved that entertainment can be a catalyst for social change, that it can give voice to the marginalized and challenge the status quo.
And on a more personal level, I think it reminds us that it's okay to be flawed, to be vulnerable, to struggle with our demons. Jessica Jones wasn't a perfect hero, and that's what made her so relatable, so human.
Her story is a testament to the power of resilience, of finding the strength to fight back, even when the odds are stacked against you. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, always the possibility for healing and growth.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Jessica Jones was more than just a superhero show. It was a cultural phenomenon that challenged our expectations, sparked important conversations, and ultimately left a lasting legacy on the entertainment industry and beyond.
It's a show that will continue to resonate with viewers for years to come, reminding us of the power of stories to change hearts, minds, and even the world itself.
So if you haven't seen Jessica Jones yet, I highly recommend checking it out. And if you're already a fan, I encourage you to revisit it with a fresh perspective, to appreciate its nuances, its complexities, and its lasting impact on the way we view superhero stories and ourselves.
And remember, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that hit closest to home. The ones that remind us that even in a world of superheroes and villains, we're all just trying to navigate the complexities of the human experience.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Jessica Jones. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration of a topic that matters. Until then, keep diving deep.